All right, we are going to get started. Can you hear me okay in the back? Thumbs up. Feeling like a DJ using the microphone, but that is okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming today. We are going to review the implementation of PBIS at a school, an elementary school that's implementing MTSS with fidelity at Tier 3. So we're going to talk about the reasons why briefly. We probably all have that basic understanding as to the importance of implementation of PBIS. So we really want to get into the nitty-gritty of Tier 2 and Tier 3. So you can leave today understanding some processes and procedures that are super effective and take them back to your schools. So just to kind of briefly introduce ourselves, I'm Jessica. And I am a school psychologist. I am very passionate about school-wide PBIS, have been interested in it for many, many years. In fact, my nickname in graduate school was just PBS. So that is how, how interested I am. I work at State College Area School District, as you can see. I also teach part-time at Penn State, both graduate level school psychology students and also school counseling students as well, and have a small consulting firm helping to improve behavioral practices in schools and also helping to refine and better identify kids under the only behavioral disability category we have under IDA, which is emotional disturbance. So I do a lot of research about emotional disturbance. So fun facts. So I will let my colleagues introduce themselves as well.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Krates. I'm a school psychologist also at the State College Area School District. I actually work specifically in Mount Nittany Elementary, which we will be talking a lot about today. I'm very interested in social emotional learning, and sort of a model to create tiered intervention of supports correlating with PBS. I don't have a cool name like Jess. People just call me Miss Leah. And I will let Tiffany introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Glab Myers. I'm a school counselor. I also work at Mount Nittany Elementary and State College. I am helping to integrate the SAP process as well as the multi-tiered systems of support into our PBS model, also with an emphasis on social emotional learning and helping to develop just these tiers a little bit more specifically in our school and how they can relate to our behavior intervention plans and things like that in our school.
Thank you. And these guys are really, the people on the ground. They are working so hard in their elementary school and have been doing a fantastic job. So today we're going to just start out with some reasons why. So we know that school safety, student behavior is a paramount concern in today's schools. Maybe for some schools it isn't, but for the majority of schools in our country, it is certainly a rising concern. Anecdotally, even when we talk about statistics, they are quite telling, but even anecdotally, people who have been in education for some time are saying, man, I haven't seen behavior like this before. So it's certainly a need. And what that tells us is that there's a need to be proactive rather than reactive. We know that when we strictly rely on reactive disciplinary techniques, we know that behaviors tend to occur more intensively, more frequently. So it might have kind of a short period of time that the behavior stops when we suspend a child. We don't have that problem for that day or those 2 or 3 days. But generally speaking, the behaviors often reoccur and often at higher rates. And there are certain groups of students that are more adversely impacted by reactive and exclusionary behavioral practices, namely Black males being the primary group who are most impacted. And we know that, there's a huge cost of waiting. So if we, rather than being proactive and preventative and rather than teaching behavior, if we solely rely on exclusionary and disciplinary practices, we know that those behaviors become entrenched within a student's behavioral repertoire. We know that when we look at most of those kids longitudinally, the outcomes can be quite negative for them. So we know that there is a critical need in establishing effective school-wide disciplinary positive behavioral practices. And we know that not only is it important for behavioral success, social emotional success, it's also really important for academic success. So there's research supporting that, you know, kind of makes sense, right? The more time in the classroom, the more time on task students are, the better the academic outcomes. And again, when we go back to that cost of waiting piece, kids who struggle behaviorally often have lower academic performance in high school. So it's really critical that we intervene early. So we all know school-wide PBIS, 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 sometimes we're all talking about the same thing, behavioral MTSS, all the same thing. It's a tiered approach, focusing on prevention and intervention that's responsive to student need. We know that the outcomes, I'm sure you guys have been to sessions already today that focuses on positive outcomes, so we won't go too much in detail there, but looking at some of them, decreases in problematic behavior, decreases in ODRs, decreases in suspensions, expulsions, improvement in school climate, improvement of teachers' perception of the school. So a plethora of positive outcomes, also some financial positive outcomes too, when we think about amount of time administrators spend with students who are experiencing behavioral problems. So we have some financial implications as well. So here's just a short little video clip. And it gives you a nice little contrast of two different methods of speaking. And you can think to yourself, how do I usually speak to my students, to my kids, to my significant other, to my friends? Oh. Well, you guys, I apologize for that. I don't know that we're going to be able to see it today, but funny little video. Oh. Oh, okay.
End show.
Oh, wait. End show. Okay. Minimize. Okay. Open things back up. And let's see if it works. That's okay. We'll just move on. It's a nice little video. It gives you a nice example of former President Obama and the way he kind of kindly and nicely polishes his statements. And then he has this man who's his anger translator, Luther. And the messages that Luther delivers are in stark contrast. So he kind of says things very bluntly. And it's funny. So if you get the chance. All right, let me get back into my slideshow. All right. Okay. And if we had some students here, we would talk about how you can work through a little bit of YouTube video frustration by remaining calm, taking a few deep breaths. That could be a tier 2 strategy. So again, you know, it's really important for us to reframe some of the statements that we have. Who here is a teacher? Who works directly with students most of the time? And for those of us who are not teachers, do I have any school counselors in the house? Awesome. How about school psychologists, school administrators, behavior specialists? Did I miss anybody? Social workers, woohoo! So for all of us, it's incredibly important for us to acknowledge that we might not always state behavioral expectations, if you will, in the most palatable fashion, especially if you're working with kids all day, every day. I have birthday parties, and at the end of 3 hours, I'm like Luther, so with a bunch of little boys. So I get it, but again, it's really important that, as a school, we focus on things like not bad behavior, but target behavior. So we have these behavioral expectations, and we know by verbalizing, here's a target behavior that we would like to change for a student. So we label the behavior, ensure that we're using measurable and observable terminology. And again, we're going to talk about the framework that Mount Nittany Elementary School has in place and how it's aligned with Pennsylvania's model. And you guys can go ahead and read through that. I'm sure you have, again, seen that before. Specifically about the district we're going to be talking about, so we can, again, walk through the process. It's the State College Area School District in central Pennsylvania, servicing students K through 12, close to 7,000 students, 8 primary schools, 2 middle, 1 high. And the elementary school specifically will serve kids K through 5, 360 students, and you can see about 33% students receiving free and reduced lunch, 11.7 to 1 student to teacher ratio, and you can see the racial demographics there. And at Mount Nittany, the behavioral expectations, if anyone is a Penn Stater, there's a big "we are." So at Mount Nittany Elementary, the mascot, of course, is the little lion, and the students are responsible, respectful, safe, and ready to learn. So they have 4 behavioral expectations. Those expectations, as you guys likely know, they're explicitly taught to all students in all settings of their day. They know what being responsible looks like in the hallway, in the classroom, in the restroom, on the bus. They know that, expectations are consistent amongst all adults within the building, the bus driver, and problematic behaviors are looked at as skill deficits rather than bad behavior. And oftentimes the students know what the expectations are. It's a point of performance deficit, so for whatever reason, the desire to hide under their desk or run around the cafeteria and throw food is stronger than that desire to, in that moment, be a respectful student in the cafeteria. So we talk about it in terms of a skill deficit and also a point of performance deficit. So what the school staff really try to capitalize on is teaching students so that they have really mastered these behavioral expectations and that they can generalize them as well. Reinforcement, this is something that I think we can all continuously work on. Sometimes we can be really vague with our reinforcement in life in general. So it's super important, and the adults continue to ensure that when they notice a child being responsible, respectful, or safe, or ready to learn, they note that expectation, and they are also very specific about what the behavior was, so the student's aware of what was noticed. Yeah. So here is just an example of the ticket system. And again, remember, the tickets aren't meant to, quote unquote, bribe kids or anything like that. They're really meant to reinforce, so adults can remember to reinforce students for that behavior. So it's a good reminder. I even use them at home just to make sure I'm providing enough positive reinforcement. And we know based on, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, there's a science behind this. Our brains are wired to remember the negative about 5 times more than we remember positive. So as adults, we really need to be cognizant that we're administering at least, 5 points of praise to every negative interaction we have with a student. One of the neat components that I really like that Mount Nittany does, they have gratitude cards, and these are for the teachers. So they have, any student can state what they're grateful for, write it down, or a teacher can write what they're grateful for. So a really neat positive psychology component to their school-wide framework. And their tickets are really pretty and colorful and engaging for the students. You can see them up there. They have whole class reinforcers. The class, of course, were the little lions, so the whole class is possum. So that's just a little review. And just briefly, we talk a lot about interventions within a school-wide PBIS model. And I think it's really important to clarify what the difference between a strategy and an intervention is. So a strategy are things that we do in the classroom that might make some changes to hopefully elicit better behavior, better learning behavior. So these things might be preferential seating, positive reinforcement, frequent movement breaks, small group instruction, etc. So those are all strategies. When we talk about interventions, they're much more targeted, they're much more specific, they're very much aimed at the skill that we want to improve or change. So, just thinking about some of those differences. So we might, when we're meeting as a team, thinking about, well, did we implement these as strategies or did we implement robust, specific, targeted interventions? One of the things I think, and you guys who are teachers can correct me if I'm wrong, but we often face students who, aren't complying with the requests or the what we need them to do in the classroom. So one of the, paramount strategies is just really maintaining that, maintaining composure. So not letting that child get under your skin and ensuring that you stay outwardly calm. So we are going to transition over to Leah.
Yeah, so like Jess said, we're going to move now into true intervention. So for students who don't respond to our Tier 1 efforts, we want to have strategies in place for them at the Tier 2 level. So something beyond what's provided universally to all kids. So typically this means, if you're familiar with the triangle, which you probably are, at the second tier there's about 10 to 15% of your students might be falling within this need range for the Tier 2 interventions. So just some features of them. They're low effort by teachers. There's extreme benefit for the students. They're really flexible as well. And there's time for team meetings and follow-up with review and revision of the plan, which is crucial. And then continuous monitoring of the student is really important as well. The monitoring will look different depending on what Tier 2 intervention you're giving, but I'll talk more about that when we talk more specifically about example interventions in Tier 2. So you want to meet as a Tier 2 team. It's recommended from Pennsylvania that we meet at least once or twice a month. In my building, we tried that last year and we found that there was just not enough time. We always went over time. So this year we meet every Friday. I don't know, raise your hand if you have PLCs in your building. So we obviously don't have a grade level team, but we are on a teacher contract, and through that we have PLC time. So our tier 2, 3 meetings are considered our PLC time, where we're looking at student data for students receiving tier 2 and 3 interventions. So just an idea, if you do have that and you're strapped for time, you guys can't find time, that was like sort of a loophole that we found in that regard. And there goes the PowerPoint, Jess. You're the tech person. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So the implementation process, and again, our system is certainly not perfect in any way. We have fidelity of implementation, so that's exciting news, but we certainly have a lot of goals that we have, but I will just share what we're doing now, and hopefully it will provide you guys with some strategies that you can use in your school as well. So this is the implementation process, and the slides that will follow this will get deeper into them, but the first thing we always do a universal screener. So 3 times per year, the teachers are filling out a screener on every single child that they have. And this is an elementary school, but at the older grades, like the middle school, they're actually filling this out themselves. And this helps us look at whether or not we have students that might be at risk, or if they're in the extremely elevated range and they need an intervention right away. Again, our tier 2 team meets 1 to 2 times per month. We actually meet 4 times now. We always discuss the interventions with the teachers and the parents. They're a really important part of the team. And in fact, I will say the interventions that we have at our school work the best when parents are involved and they have like a home school component. So getting them involved is really helpful. We review data regularly for the students that are receiving tier 2, 3, interventions, and again, that data will look different depending on the intervention that they get. We also check for fidelity. So if the plan is not being implemented with fidelity, we don't really have any grounds, of course, to say that it's not working. So we make sure that the plans are being implemented with fidelity before we say that a change might be needed. And then, of course, we're meeting to determine whether or not that student might need tier 3 supports. So in terms of the universal screener, there are a lot of different ones out there. We personally use Review 360 through Pearson. I'm not here to promote them at all, but it's what works really well for us. We have what's considered passive consent in our handbook that we are going to take part in this throughout the year. We do have parents who opt their students out of the screener, which is an option. This year, I don't think we had any that did that. You can always send out an email before the screening. But what we've found is that the screening is really helpful for us in determining who might be showing some internalizing symptoms. So behaviors, outward behaviors are easy to see, they're easily brought up to us, but the screener that we use looks at internalizing, externalizing, and adaptive functioning as well. And it actually shows us if they're at normal, at risk, or elevated risk in each of those categories, so we know which skill to hone in on. And this screener takes about 15 minutes for the teacher, and they do it at faculty meetings. So this is just an example of the data that the screener gives us. As a whole, it shows us for the whole building what percentage of students we have in the elevated risk category and then the extremely elevated risk. Obviously, if you're going to screen, then you must intervene. So if we have students in the red, we create plans for them, whether that be tier 2 or tier 3, it depends on the need. And then if we have any students that pop up to us that haven't been brought to our attention, particularly before that, which is very rare, usually the students that come up on the screener we already know about, but if they do come up, it's really helpful for us in catching those kids that we weren't aware of before, and then we go right to the teacher and talk with them about what they might be seeing. This is just another example of how your screener data can be broken down, so you can see by grade level, and then of course you can see by student. So in terms of the team composition, in the tiered fidelity inventory that Pennsylvania uses to evaluate your PBIS efforts, they recommend that you have a definition of your role within that team. That will depend on who's on the team in your building, what your team members bring in terms of expertise, comfort level, ability, feasibility of what they can do. This is personally what worked for us. So our tier 2, 3 team is myself, the counselor, the principal. We also brought in our school nurse, which we found really helpful. We had a lot of students going to the nurse with somatic complaints who were feeling like maybe they were sick, and really we find out that it's something else going on. And then we've also integrated ESAP into our PBIS process. So our ESAP liaison comes twice a month out of our 4 meetings as well. And this is just a breakdown of our roles. We found that last year or 2 years ago now, when we did not have Fidelity, we would often leave meetings and then say, wait a minute, are you doing that? Are you doing that? Are you going to follow up the teacher? Are you going to call home? Who's going to help the teacher get started? Who's going to meet with the student? This has really helped the process, so I highly recommend coming up with roles so that you have a meeting and leave the meeting, know exactly what the next steps are, and you can get those interventions in place as quickly as possible. And I already mentioned this before. We meet twice a month. Or 4 times a month. 2 times a month, we look at new referrals. And then twice a month, we look at the data for students in Tier 2. So we have a list, and we go right through them. We look at their progress monitoring data, and we make decisions based on the data that we have about whether or not they have a need to alter the plan. So that twice a month that I mentioned where we look at new referrals, this is what we're looking at. So the first thing is the universal screening data, if we have it, those 3 times per year. Another thing would be the office disciplinary referrals. So do we have frequent high flyers coming up over and over again? If so, do we need to look into something? We're also looking at, we have an MTSS referral form that the teacher fills out if they feel like they have implemented strategies in the classroom. They've been implementing Tier 1 universal strategies. They feel like the student needs something beyond what they can provide themselves or alone, or they need support. They can fill out a referral. So we look at these referrals 2 times per month. And then, of course, we'll follow up with the teacher about next steps. We also monitor significant changes, of course, in academic behavior or home life. We also monitor attendance as well, and then high number of nurse visits. So this is the referral process for us as a core team. So those, the nurse, the principal, those people I just mentioned. If we have a student that comes up during that meeting that we would like to refer for a potential Tier 2 or 3 intervention, this is the process that we follow. So an indicator of concern is brought up. We reach out to the teacher. We have a team meeting, usually with all relevant players, and then we discuss appropriate next steps. If we determine that a Tier 2 or 3 intervention is needed, we, of course, contact the family. They're involved in creating the plan, the students involved in creating the plan, and we obtain permission as well. And then, of course, the teacher can refer a student as well, just like I mentioned before, and this is the process that they would follow. So if they feel like they need to make a referral, they have a referral form. We previously had quite a lengthy referral form, and let's be honest, you don't have time to fill that out. You don't have time to do a lot of things during the day. So we made it really brief and simple, checkbox of what your concerns are, what you've tried, have you contacted the parent, and what do you hope to gain from this referral? What's your goal of reaching out to us? And this is all in our PBIS handbook for the staff. So in terms of how progress is monitored for a Tier 2 intervention, it really depends on the intervention that you are giving. Some interventions are much more difficult to monitor progress. Things like skills groups can be hard, but things like a pre and a post survey might be helpful. You can give it to the student or you can give it to the adult. Tracking percentages of points is obviously the easiest one, so if you have check-in, check-out, you can easily monitor that. Tracking of office disciplinary referrals, so if little Joey had 4 office disciplinary referrals this month and then we implemented an intervention, how many office disciplinary referrals do they have this month? Have they gone down? Have they increased? Have they stayed the same? Tracking of nurse visits can be helpful too. We had a student who was going to the nurse on a daily basis. We implemented an intervention and her nurse visits dropped. Time on task data as well. Somebody can go in, do a quick time on task observation. So there's a lot of different ways to track data, but you want to make sure you're tracking data so that you're making decisions based on the data rather than, you know, how we're all feeling about what's happening, which can be really difficult. But this is an example of data that we tracked for a student on check-in, check-out, and our counselor coordinates the check-in, check-out program, so I'll actually let her talk a little bit about what the numbers in this graph mean.
So as you can see on the graph here, we track the points daily for check-in and check-out. So the pink dots are the daily score that the student obtained for that day. And then the black line coming across is the goal. So at first we set the goal at baseline data and then eventually increase that goal over time as the student is seeing success. And the red line is like an average line or a trend line. And so what I'll do is on a bi-weekly basis, I'll collect all the check-in and check-out sheets, input the data into the graph format, and then that graph gets shared with teachers, parents, and the student. And even students as young as kindergarten are able to make that connection that when my red line is going up, my behavior choices are improving. And they know too that when their pink dots are above the black line, they're meeting or exceeding our expectations. So as you can see, it was like a rocky start perhaps for this student, but eventually we saw some progress over time and things really improved. So this is a really nice way to keep the students involved, to talk with them, to have meetings with them about their progress, to show them concretely how things are going. This is also a really great, quick, easy way to show teachers and families how things are going with this intervention. And it really does help us track the progress. So if we can see that the data points daily are above our expected goal line, we know that we can then increase that goal over time. So the goal, obviously long-term, would then be to increase that goal until we're reaching the expected level of compliance for that student. So this is just one way that we track data for check-in, check-out, but it's been really helpful and really easy to see visually. So.
Yeah, so like she mentioned with the baseline data, so if you see that very first dot, before we implement any plan at the tier 2 or 3 level, we like to collect baseline data. So where is the student right now without any intervention? So if we're going to set a goal for, okay, he needs to earn 50% of his points today to have his special time with a friend, is that feasible for him? Where can we start where we know the student will be successful so that they have a positive view about the plan, they have buy-in with the plan, and then we can slowly build up. So the teacher will actually secretly collect the data for a few days, and if we find that, okay, Joey can follow directions about 50% of the time, then when we start the plan, they start at 50%. That's their goal. Once we see success, we bump it up to 55, 60, 65, and then eventually we don't ever get to 100 because even adults are not 100% all day long. And then the goal would be to slowly phase it out. So you phase it in slowly and then you phase it out. So in terms of the fidelity checks, this can be a little bit tricky because as a teacher, it can feel like somebody is coming in and evaluating you. Our goal with fidelity checks is not evaluative in any way. It's to come in and ensure that the plan is implemented the way that it needs to be. And if it's not, how can we coach as a team each other or change the plan to make it more feasible? Maybe it's not feasible for the teacher to give little Johnny a star every 2 minutes, right? If they can't do that, then the plan is not feasible and then it won't be implemented with fidelity. So we want to make sure that we're creating plans that are feasible for the teachers and effective. So the fidelity checks are more than just coming in and making sure the plan is being implemented. It's really to help us all make sure that this plan is able to be followed through with as a team. We have a couple behavior specialists in our building that we share, so we don't often see them, but they've actually offered to come in and do that as sort of like an unbiased party to come in and see if it's happening. So that's an option maybe if you have behavior specialists at your school. So examples of Tier 2 interventions, there are a lot of Tier 2 interventions out there. These are a few that we're going to talk about today. If you were in the last session, you probably heard a lot about check-in, check-out, but hopefully we can share some new information. So check-in, check-out is a targeted intervention that can be used to decrease chronic low-level behaviors that are not dangerous. It's most effective with students who are reinforced by that adult attention because it gives them adult attention at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, and then obviously, of course, throughout the day. Raise your hand if you are familiar with check-in, check-out. Okay, good. I won't go into too much detail then. It's based on the idea of behavior report cards. Increased adult feedback is crucial. It increases the structure of the student's day. And then it's helpful with sharing information with families too. So that graph that Tiffany shared, we actually send home with the students once a week so that the family can see what kind of progress the student is making. So I'm going to try to play a video. We'll see if it works. Okay. Okay, you can end it. Yeah, you can just pull it back up. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay. All right, we'll just skip it. Yeah, yep. Oh, it worked? I'll show like 30 seconds. All right, here's an example.
What's that?
That's another check-in and check-out of somebody who had the perfect day, so we put it on the wall of fame. You gonna be the next one?
Because we do check-in and check-out, students feel supported through a positive relationship every single day, which builds their capacity to be successful students.
I know you can do it. Okay.
At Fall Hamilton, we've really put a lot of effort in building positive relationships.
Hi.
How was your day?
Good.
One strategy we utilize is our check-in and check-out system, where adults are meeting with kids every single day, and it's not their classroom teacher.
Yes, I do.
We have 41 students on check-in and check-out here.
You're gonna do great, aren't you?
And we identify the students that just need a little bit more support, where they're struggling meeting some of their requirements on an educational level, but more of a social and emotional level as well.
You did. I'm so proud of you.
The child knows every day they come in this building that somebody's excited to see them in the morning and excited to see them right before they leave.
Hey, Mariah.
Hi.
You ready to have another great day today?
Yep.
My check-in, check-out buddy, her name is Mariah, and she's in 4th grade. She has 3 goals every day that she works on.
What are your goals for today?
Listen.
All right, guys, so you get the picture. We're running out of time, so we're going to keep moving. I know. This school was great. As you could see, every teacher was involved, which was awesome. I think it's important to remember that a lot of people can act as a mentor for check-in, check-out. Our nurse is a mentor. We've had our secretary as a mentor. Our principal is a mentor. So it doesn't just have to be teachers. Our librarian, anybody that the child might develop a positive relationship with. Okay.
And our materials are available online, so you can find the video link that way too.
Yeah, and watch Luther. Luther's really funny. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to skip over this for the sake of time, but you will have a copy of this. This is just an example of a check-in, check-out sheet for younger students. You can see their goal is up in the top corner there. We like to have the visuals on there for the younger students. For the older students, we have a pause scoreboard to make it more like a game for them. Lunch and recess are not part of this particular plan, but it certainly can be if that's a problem area. And then up at the top, their goal will be at the top. It should be aligned with your tier 1. So if your tier 1 is responsible, respectful, and safe, what are they going to do that's respectful? That term can be very vague to an elementary child, so we have to be really specific. When I say respectful, I mean you are raising your hand. So if you're trying to decrease blurting out behavior, their goal could be raise your hand. That's respectful. So be very concrete in your definition of what those things mean, especially for the younger kids. And there's a lot of evidence base out there that this is effective with behaviors and teacher attention. And again, it's not as effective for students who aren't as motivated by adult attention. So here's some other tier 2 interventions.
Oh, yeah. So we hear a lot about check-in, check-out, but what other options do we have? Does anyone utilize behavior contracts, have experience with behavior contracts? So these are just some examples and some basic information about behavior contracts. And I think some of the key elements of that contract are that it should articulate the expectations of the students, of the parents, and carrying out the plan. So ensuring that the contract is specific, it talks about who does what and what are the outcomes. Really important to have the student involved in planning the behavior contract. Has anyone ever had a student negotiate their behavior contract? more about like the reinforcement, right? So that can be kind of fun. That helps them get involved in the process, and also helps kind of tease out who's going to be a future attorney, perhaps, when they're negotiating their behavioral contract. So you can see, student will participate in class activities, raising hand, being recognized by the classroom specialist teacher before offering an answer or a comment. So it's very clear about what behavior we're expecting from the student, right? And there are some really good examples online. Is anyone familiar with interventioncentral.com? So if you want to search that up, there's some nice examples and exemplars of behavior contracts on that website. Just some more specific information about what they should include. Make sure you're choosing target behaviors that are easy to observe and verify. And also have areas for signatures. Even little ones can sign their behavior contract. Make sure that's part of it. If possible, teacher, parent, and child sign the contract, and just some helpful tips associated with that.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about some other Tier 2 level interventions that we do in our school, one of which being skill-based groups. So Leah, as the school psychologist, and myself facilitate the skill-based groups. We, in these groups, really focus on areas of skill deficit, so some things that we have worked on before: social skills, self-regulation, anxiety reduction, ways to handle social and peer interactions that come up, skills related to executive functioning, things like that. And so when we do those skills-based groups, we really want to try to make sure that we are implementing evidence-based programs so that we know that the material that we're presenting to students is going to be effective. We want to make sure we implement those skill groups with fidelity. We do our best to try to monitor progress. So some ways that we do that are with pre and post assessments, with teacher feedback, teacher input forms, and observations, things of that nature, are ways that we monitor the skill-based groups and their progress. And then additionally, we want to try to provide strategies for generalization. So oftentimes we will write parent letters home after each session. We will create like a Google Doc or a teacher handout so that they can be generalizing these skills into the classroom setting. So it's not just they learn the skills, but also they have the ability to utilize those skills in their regular settings. So we really want to make sure that not only can they rattle off the skills, but they are also have the ability to utilize them, know when to use them, and then to tie that back to Tier 1, are being reinforced when they're using those skills in the regular setting. So just some examples of things that we've used. We use Second Step, Coping Cat, and so those are some different areas of skill-based groups that we have used.
And also some skill-based strategies for these groups. These are some worksheets that we could have students fill out, and we talk about statements and ask them if they say it or swallow it. So for example, I like the way you did your hair today. Should I say it or should I swallow it? Why are you wearing that shirt? Should I say it or should I swallow it? Or on Friday night when my son said, Mom, you're wearing those pants again? And I said, should you say that or swallow that one? He doesn't like when I do that to him. Other strategies: stop and think or act on impulse. So we can help kids identify, is this something that I should stop and think, or should I just act on my impulse? A really great book, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, a graduate student colleague of mine, a former graduate student colleague of mine wrote it. It's called the CBT Toolbox for Children and Adolescents. It has a number of excellent worksheets when working with specific groups of students, and it's differentiated by the areas that you want to work on. So if we're working on social skills or impulse control, there's a lot of different worksheets for all of that. Another example of methods to help students state ways to control some of their emotional outcomes. Self-monitoring form, I like to use these. I usually don't do the fancy version. I usually ask teachers to help me jazz things up, or sometimes students help me jazz things up. So this is me, you know, my pretty basic, but then I ask them to make it look pretty. And if I have a student who struggles with keeping their hands to themselves, we make this form, and we have the student, if they're at a place where they're able to and willing to self-monitor, help self-monitor that behavior so they're more aware. You'll notice I like to use yes or no versus things like, for younger kids, smiley faces or frowny faces. I think it's really important to not attach any emotional, you know, kind of facial affect to their behavior. So it's important just, did I do it? Did I not do it? And then we move forward.
Thank you. So we have a couple other of Tier 2 interventions within the school, one of which is the mentor program. So we have some adult volunteers in our school that are positive and supportive. It's kind of like the elementary school version of Big Brother, Big Sister. And the students just get to be with that mentor as a point of contact, a positive face within the school, usually somebody that does not have to provide any sort of discipline or place any academic demands on the student. So we usually try to pair students with somebody with a similar interest as them. So in the beginning of the year, we ask for faculty and staff volunteers. They fill out just like a brief survey about themselves that helps us get to know their interests, the areas in which they'd like to work, or the types of students they'd be comfortable working with. And a lot of times you'll find that sometimes teachers maybe that teach like a higher primary grade might like to spend some time with a younger student, or vice versa. And so that gives us a good idea of how to pair up the groupings. They can do really simple activities together, like having lunch, taking a walk, playing a board game, allowing the student to bring a peer in for lunch, those sorts of things. And so it's just really simple, but it's usually about weekly time that they can just get together and spend time together so that student has a really positive adult connection with school. We have found that students really enjoy this time, look forward to this time, and so it helps build that positive school connection. We just ask to monitor this by basically the mentor just keeps a log of the date and the time that they met with the student and the activities that they did together. And if anything, we're not asking the adult mentor to be like a counselor or anything like that, a therapist to the student. So if there are any issues that come up, they certainly do refer them to us, and we help handle those situations. They're just really there to be a positive adult in that student's life. Another Tier 2 intervention that we have is Lunch Bunch. Lunch Bunch is fairly unstructured. It's just a time for students and their peers to come in to have lunch with an adult. It can be really helpful for students that are having difficulty navigating social situations. It promotes some positive peer relationships. The nice thing about a lunch bunch is we can help facilitate the conversation, we can help navigate any social situations that might come up, and really promote some pro-social interactions in those lunch bunches. So a lot of times they're fairly unstructured, or we might have little games or activities for the students to engage in while they are there, but it's just, again, another nice opportunity for students to build some social relationships with peers, and again, it gives them some extra time with an adult.
Okay. So Tier 3, intensive intervention. So after we've implemented a Tier 2 intervention for at least 6 to 8 weeks is what we try for. When we think about behavior change, we know it's long, especially for adults who think about trying to get to the gym more often. It can take some time to form a new habit. So after it's implemented with fidelity for about 6 to 8 weeks, without the student showing adequate growth, we may consider Tier 3. That is not to say that you can't jump straight to Tier 3. While we want to make sure that we're moving through a least restrictive environment for the student, there are situations where the behavior is so extreme that we know we need to go to a more intensive intervention. If they're eloping the building, if they're physically aggressive, things like that on a daily basis. So just something to keep in mind. So in terms of the referral process, it really just is meeting with the team like we do to look at the data, and if they're not meeting their goal and they're not showing growth, then we might consider moving to a more intensive intervention. These are just some examples of Tier 3 interventions. It might look different depending on your access to resources, depending on what school you're in, but for us, Tier 3 interventions usually include referral to a community supports. This could be like a TSS in the building. Like I said, we've integrated SAP into our PBIS program, so our counselor, Tiffany, usually facilitates that. We would consider that Tier 3. Individual support, so in thinking about like a skills group where there's multiple kids in one group, some students might need more one-on-one individualized supports. And then lastly, if the behavior is externalizing, we might complete an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, and then use that data to create a behavior intervention plan, which unlike check in, check out is much more individualized for the student. So that would be done by probably your school psychologist, behavior specialist, counselor. In terms of the FBA process, again, we found last year that we were leaving meetings thinking who's doing what and when. So we created a 4-step process of who's doing what by when. So that would, the FBA always includes team interviews, parents, students, teacher. We complete the direct observation of the child. We create a summary of that, which will usually be your school psychologist, behavior specialist. Then you meet to create a behavior intervention plan. I'm going to go through this quickly because I know we're running out of time, but we're happy to answer questions later. If you are a teacher, you can certainly use aspects of functional behavior assessment in your classroom, even though you're not in there conducting FBAs. So what we're looking for, again, is what's the target behavior, not the bad behavior, but what is the target behavior we want to change? What's the potential function? So what is that behavior serving for that student? What are they trying to obtain? This is an example of what the data might look like at the end. So for this, it looks like right after the student was given a teacher direction, they often were non-compliant and then avoided the task. So we want to figure out that sequence so that we create a behavior plan for them. So if you have your IU or whoever evaluates you when they come in to evaluate your PBIS program, in addition to the tiered fidelity inventory, they also have this checklist that they will bring that they use to specifically score your behavior intervention plans. So our behavior intervention plans were based on this information, and we have the same format for every student. The information in the plan will obviously be individualized for the student based on their need. And if you would like to see that, I have a copy with me if you want to see it. There's also some on online as well. So here's Oprah. Everybody gets a behavior plan, right? So the behavior plan, you're the Oprah lady, you want to do it? No. So a behavior plan is not always the answer, all right? I think we often feel like this is the only thing that we can do, but this is really, there's lots of different Tier 3 interventions that are out there. Behavior intervention plans are only one. But the plan isn't working. All right, so this happens a lot. We try a new plan 2 days in, and the kid is going through an extinction burst. Raise your hand if you've heard about what an extinction burst is. So I want you to think about every day when you go home, you put your key in your door to open it, right? Why do you do this? Because it works. What happens when it doesn't work? You jam your key in harder and harder, right? You try what you've done 1,000 other times before, but you ramp it up, okay? So when we are extinguishing a behavior that was previously reinforced over and over and over again, and we remove it, they're going to try what they tried 100 days before that to get that, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I always tell teams, buckle your seatbelts. If we see an extinction burst, it probably means that the plan is actually working. So just something to think about. Another thing to think about is how long have you tried it? Has it been a couple of days? Probably not long enough to determine whether it's working or not. Is it being implemented with fidelity across settings? So when this child goes to the specials room, are they being reinforced like you're reinforcing them in their classroom? Are the reinforcers appropriate? Right? That's why we complete the FBA to see what they are seeking. If we're trying to give them stickers and they don't care about stickers, it's probably not going to work, right? And then all the goals appropriate. So again, thinking about that baseline, where should we start to get buy-in, positive feelings about the plan, and then how can we increase it after that? So just like Tier 2, we monitor the student's progress. For Tier 3 students, we actually meet monthly with the parent if possible, and we look at their progress monitoring data, and then we're completing those fidelity checks as well. So I know that was a lot really fast. But does anybody have any questions about any of that?
On the shared drive, that shared Google Drive, it should be labeled school climate. And if it's not labeled appropriately, let me know, but it is there on that shared PBIS drive.
How do you structure your team when you're putting a tier 3 plan together? So for example, I know you talked about working towards MTSS with those ones together. So do you have an academic and a behavioral team, or do you have two separate teams?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so he's wondering, we mentioned MTSS, which looks at academics and behavior. So he's wondering if we have one team for behavior and one for academics. We have an MTSS core team that is the people that were on that list, but it also includes our reading specialists, math interventionists. I think that's it. And the Title I reading. So we meet as a core team as well, because we also have response to intervention and instruction. But those meetings that I was talking about that happen every Friday, that's really just the social emotional part. And then we meet also as a response to intervention team as well throughout the year.
So tier 2 meetings are happening once a week, and then your MTSS core team, are they also meeting once a week?
We meet about once a month as a whole MTSS core team. Yep, yeah. That's a great question, though. One thing I will say, too, we often get questions about whether or not a student with an IEP can have access to Tier 2, 3 interventions. The answer is yes, of course they can. So if a child with an IEP, let's say they're receiving learning support for reading, they can certainly have access to a Tier 2 check-in, check-out plan. I think that's important to keep in mind. Sometimes we think they're this or that. They could have a combination of supports. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you have the time for like a check-in, check-outs and mentoring? Is there a certain time during your school day, or do you use classroom teachers for that, or is it just?
This year we don't have classroom teachers, but I've had many classroom teachers that volunteer. It takes about a minute in the morning. The kids run up to the teacher and they pump them up and say, all right, remember your goal is this, have a great day, and then they send them off and then come back. That's really all the time that it takes for that. For the mentors, they're mostly meeting with the kid during lunchtime. Yep. Yeah, and they're also volunteers.
If we have any other questions, we can stick around up front. I think it's time for the code now, and I know you guys have another session to go to. Thank you very much for your time and your sustained attention and your responsibility and being safe and all that good stuff.
How about a big round of applause for our team? Wonderful job today.